Hello, this is Grant Hughes of Grant Hughes Investigates on YouTube. As we know, on November 13th, 2022, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Madison Mogen, and Kaylee Gonzalez were all murdered between 4:09 and 4:18 a.m. in the early morning hours. DNA has become a huge part of this case, as the DNA of Bryan Kohberger was found on the button of a knife sheath found in Madison Mogen's bedroom. Today's video will be regarding the DNA in the case and what problems there may or may not be regarding how the DNA was obtained and how Bryan Kohberger's name was produced from that DNA. If you've read the probable cause document, you'll know that they found the knife sheath in Madison Mogen's bedroom on her bed. So let's just read that portion of it. As I entered this bedroom, this is a detective, I could see two females in the single bed in the room. Both Gonzalez and Mogen were deceased with visible stab wounds. I also later noticed what appeared to be a tan leather knife sheath laying on the bed next to Mogen's right side when viewed from the door. The sheath was later processed and had K-Bar, USMC, and the United States Marine Corps Eagle Globe and Anchor insignia stamped on the outside of it. The Idaho State Lab later located a single source of male DNA left on the button snap of the knife sheath. Let's reenact what the officer did. So he came up here, he did look at a body camera of another officer and saw in Kaylee Gonzalez's room and also saw Murphy the dog in that room. And then he goes into Madison Mogen's bedroom right here and turns around, and I guess you could see on the bed here the knife sheath. Now this is exactly how I think the layout must be in that room, because they note that the knife sheath was found on the right side of Madison Mogen underneath a quilt and underneath her right side. Now if Madison in white here was on the left hand side over here, they would have said the knife sheath was between Madison and Kaylee. If Madison was on her back right here, again they would say that the knife sheath was between Madison and Kaylee because it would be right in between them here. If Madison was against the wall over here laying like this, they would again say it was between both of them if she was laying like this. But if you flip her over on her back, they would have said it was between the wall and her underneath the quilt. I think it's identical to the way I have shown right here on the screen. On June 16th, 2023, a document was shown on the Idaho Judicial website, which has all the documents associated with the Bryan Kohberger case on there. I think it was called the Motion for Protective Order. It states this: on November 13th, 2022, law enforcement found the bodies of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho. All four victims died from apparent knife wounds. Law enforcement found a K-Bar knife sheath on a bed next to the bodies of Madison and Kaylee. The sheath was face down and partially under both Madison's body and the comforter on the bed. Law enforcement seized the K-Bar knife sheath pursuant to a search warrant. The Idaho State Police Lab in Meridian, Idaho, located DNA on the K-Bar knife sheath. The ISP laboratory determined the DNA came from a single source and the source was male. Now it's very important to find a single source of DNA, because when you mix DNA it's very hard to separate the two sources and come up with a viable sequence. Once law enforcement had single source DNA from the K-Bar knife sheath, they conducted what is called a short tandem repeat, or STR, analysis. STR DNA analysis involves looking at 20 regions within human DNA and allows law enforcement to make a direct comparison between two STR DNA profiles. Law enforcement submitted the STR DNA profile obtained from the K-Bar knife sheath to the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a database of STR DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scene evidence, to identify the source of the DNA. No match was found. Unable to find a match using STR-DNA analysis, law enforcement decided to use investigative genetic genealogy to find a lead. Genetic genealogy allows individuals to trace their lineage to connect with unknown family members using DNA. If you're somebody who's been following this channel from the beginning of this case, you know that early on in the investigation, I contacted Misty Gillis of Identifiers International, an amazing forensic genetic genealogy company that we work with. We've funded over $70,000 from my channel worth of investigative genetic genealogy on different cases and trying to determine Jane and John Does, and even in criminal cases. I asked Misty at the time what it would take to do rapid forensic genetic genealogy in a case, and then after discussing it for a while, she thinks it might have taken about 2 or 3 days to take the sequence, get it set up to be uploaded to GEDmatch or Ancestry DNA, and then have a forensic genetic genealogist start working on it. Now that's the part that you can't determine, because depending on how complex it is, it determines how long it might take to find the person in the family trees that you're looking for. As a recap, after finding the USMC K-bar knife sheath on the bed of Madison Mogen underneath the comforter and her right side, the Idaho State Police Lab in Meridian, Idaho was able to locate a single source of DNA on the button of the K-bar knife sheath. After obtaining the sequence from this DNA, they uploaded it to CODIS, and they were unable to find a match. Then investigators turned to forensic genetic genealogy. Forensic genetic genealogy uses the same technology that Ancestry.com, 23andMe uses to determine your ancestry. When you send in a sample by spitting into a container, you send it off to Ancestry.com, and then Ancestry.com loads your profile into the system and compares it to the millions of other samples they have and determines who you are connected with, and it gives you your results. It also gives you information about where you're from, your regions, ethnicity, etc. And some of the people in Ancestry.com are actually just people that have been put in on family trees that other individuals who have sent in their DNA have created. So if you're somebody who comes in later and you find out, oh, my mom's on there, your mom may have put in your grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, and all their cousins and relatives over the years. And let's discuss that process right now. On Ancestry.com, which I happen to have a profile on, it allows you to download your DNA in a raw format in a zip file. And as you can see on the screen right now, here's an example of that. And after you click on the I understand, it sends you an email and then a download link, and you download your zip file after you assume the risk of having your profile out there. So I have my DNA profile downloaded to me, and then after you've downloaded the profile, you go to a place like GEDmatch. It's a publicly available database. There's a professional version on there as well, but it allows you to take your raw file from a place like Ancestry.com and upload it. As you can see, here's your GEDmatch raw DNA upload utility. It allows you to choose the file, and you go out and you browse on your computer to find the zip file that you just downloaded from Ancestry.com. And right here, here's the opt-in portion on GEDmatch. And notice they have it in green. Most popular, they say. They want people to opt in to the ability for law enforcement to use it. It says on this one, we will compare your DNA kit to all other kits in the GEDmatch database to find your matching genetic relatives. Kits in the database include those submitted by users undertaking personal genetic genealogy research, adoptees, users, including law enforcement, attempting to identify unidentified human remains, and law enforcement attempting to identify perpetrators of violent crimes. Your kit will be compared with kits submitted by law enforcement to identify perpetrators of violent crimes. The operators of GEDmatch encourage everybody to select this option. And, bravo to GEDmatch for trying to convince people the importance of selecting that and opting in. Now, there's other options here that don't allow law enforcement to use those profiles. Once you've uploaded your kit, I don't know why I have these other two. I think I had 2 failed attempts at uploading at one point. But this is the kit right here. It has my name on it, and right over here it says Kit Privacy, and it has that police symbol on there, meaning that law enforcement can use it. You can see that right there. Once it's been uploaded, and it takes some time for it to go out and search the system to find your matches, you get something that looks like this. It comes back, you get email address and names over here, usually aliases, or usually not people's names, but some people do put their names there. The key here, though, is right here in this column where it says total centimorgans. Centimorgans really represents the amount of shared DNA that you have with any particular individual. For example, this one right here is 756. Now that is up in that first cousin range where you're very closely related to this person here. It does turn out in this case that randomly we had a woman in our family who came forward after, I think she was 40-something years old, who happened to be the daughter of one of my mom's sisters. And she was given up for adoption at birth, apparently. I was doing an experimental genetic genealogy practice trying to locate myself and pretending I was unknown and finding my relatives and trying to find myself. Luckily, I knew that this person existed because it would have been virtually impossible to use the 756 centimorgan relative there because she was adopted, and those are very difficult to figure out. You're not really sure how or why you're related to that person. So I would have started here at 251, 123. 251 is pretty good relative there, but what you do in general is you find out who these people are, and you start building out your tree, and you try to find a common ancestor on both sides of the tree of the mother and father, and then narrow it down to the individual you are looking for. Now, there's also a place called MyHeritage here, and this is sort of an enigma in the genetic genealogy world, because on their site they allow you to upload the raw data kit from Ancestry.com or 23andMe. So MyHeritage is almost like a crossover between GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, which are 2 publicly available databases where you upload your raw data for research. This one is sort of a hybrid here, MyHeritage, where you can upload your raw data to it. Right here you can see where it says upload the DNA, and you are able to upload to MyHeritage. Now MyHeritage has updated their policy where it says that if you upload your raw data, law enforcement cannot use the data, but if they have a warrant and is properly submitted, then they can upload data and try to determine who a suspect is, but they need to have a warrant to do so. This is something that's interesting here. On June 21st, 2023, that was right after the June 16th document came out on the Idaho court system website that we just discussed a minute ago. These are some of the things that they changed to. MyHeritage will never provide data to insurance companies under the circumstances. MyHeritage prohibits law enforcement use of its DNA services. Then down here, we will not provide information to law enforcement unless we are required by a valid court order or subpoena for genetic information. We will not disclose any of your personal information to any third party except in the following very limited circumstances: when required of us by law or during legal proceedings or to prevent fraud and cybercrime. So that is how they've updated it on their website. And I don't know what it said prior to June 21st, 2023. Perhaps somebody has that information on a Wayback Machine out there. I don't know. So just to recap that portion, people upload their genetic information to websites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. When you do that, you'll find matches of yourself, and you can determine where you are on a family tree. In cases of an unknown suspect, there are places like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA which allow you to upload a raw data file. Those sites are generally used by the public just to research their own family. And now you might ask yourself, this is the key question that people ask, well, how do you get the raw data file from an unknown suspect at a crime scene? You know, people spit into these containers and they send it off to 23andMe and Ancestry.com, and their proprietary systems there allow you then to later download a raw data file. But when you have an unknown suspect and you gather DNA from a crime scene, it's not spit or anything like that that you can send into Ancestry. So you have to have a way to create that kit. And there's a company named Bioinformatics that is able to take a DNA sequence and make a kit that can then be uploaded to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, and I guess even now to MyHeritage, but that website does not allow for use of law enforcement unless you have a warrant. So that's something important to know, is that is how they create the sort of the raw data file or kit to upload to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. Those are the two main ones that are used. The issue in this case is, did law enforcement use a loophole in the GEDmatch process? So let's go down here where it describes the loophole in this article right here on The Intercept. The loophole, which a source demonstrated for The Intercept, allows genealogists working with police to manipulate search fields within a DNA comparison tool to trick the system into showing opted-out profiles. So if you remember earlier when we were showing this screen right here, it says opt-in. Now this opt-out profile is what people clicked on. They didn't want their DNA used for law enforcement use, right? But that's what it's saying right here. The loophole, which a source demonstrated for The Intercept, allows genealogists working with police to manipulate search fields within a DNA comparison tool to trick the system into showing opted-out profiles. In records of communications reviewed by The Intercept, Moore and two other forensic genetic genealogists discussed the loophole and how to trigger it. In a separate communication, one of the genealogists described hiding the fact that her organization had made an identification using an opted-out profile. So basically what genetic genealogists do is they give a tip or lead to the law enforcement agencies saying, we believe it's this person, and then law enforcement has to take that information and go out and verify its veracity and try to determine if it indeed is the individual. Now this article goes on to say, the communications are a disturbing example of how genetic genealogists and their law enforcement partners, in their zeal to close criminal cases, skirt privacy rules put in place by DNA database companies to protect their customers. And that is interesting, right? See, in this case, they have a DNA profile. That means if a lead that is generated doesn't turn up the right person, it will let you know immediately, and nobody would even know, like the individual who they were perhaps looking at that wasn't correct would never even know that they were looking for them. And I guess this is where my heritage might come into place. Is it possible that law enforcement or genetic genealogists have uploaded raw data file or kits, maybe even produced again by bioinformatics, to their database on MyHeritage, which has access to millions of more records than GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA? Do they have anything in their process that allows them to determine if somebody is doing that? We don't know. I guess this is one of those things. Do the ends justify the means? That's something people will have to determine. And recently, in a ruling, this is back on October 31st, the Idaho judge gives Bryan Kohberger win over genetic genealogy battle. An Idaho judge gave a quadruple murder suspect, Bryan Kohberger's defense, a minor victory last week after denying their efforts to dismiss the indictment against him for the stabbing deaths of the 4 university students last year. Kohberger, who is accused of killing Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, and Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin in a 4 a.m. ambush. It's actually at between 4:08 and 4:20 in an on-campus rental home, is seeking specific details about how law enforcement used investigative genetic genealogy, IGG, to thumb him as a suspect after he allegedly left a K-bar knife sheath with his DNA on it under Mogen's body. In a 32-page order, Judge John Judge granted a requested... By the way, I mean, is there any chance that this guy wouldn't have been a judge with the last name of Judge? He granted a request for an in-camera review of the IGG evidence. He will look at all the IGG evidence in the possession of the Latah County Prosecutor's Office and the FBI and determine what should be shared with the defense, what should be kept secret, and what will be redacted from the public. So, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, at least they get to see the work that went into it. Now, the defense team will likely make a big deal if they use something like the loophole that we just mentioned. They're trying to get the DNA thrown out. And then when you throw out that DNA, what else collapses? Because if you determine that the DNA was obtained, for lack of a better term, illegally, and that DNA is what led to Bryan Kohberger's house, and after going to Bryan Kohberger's house and getting DNA, it led to Bryan Kohberger himself, and then they got the warrant. Does it throw out all of that stuff in a cascading effect? That's something that, a judge would have to determine. I don't believe that it does that whatsoever, because, again, genetic genealogy is just giving a lead to the detectives. So given all the information we've just gone over, in the same June 16th document, it says, in this case, investigators use IGG to begin the process of developing a lead to the individual who left DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. The Idaho State Police utilized a private laboratory to develop a SNP profile from the DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. The private laboratory started using genetic genealogy to develop a family tree, but after law enforcement decided the FBI would take over, the private laboratory ceased its efforts and sent the SNP profile to the FBI. The FBI uploaded the SNP profile to one or more publicly available genetic genealogy services to identify possible family members of the suspect based on shared genetic data. The FBI could then view, through the Genetic Genealogy Services portal, information regarding potential relatives of the suspect who left DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. Based on information the FBI could see in the Genetic Genealogy Services portal, the FBI went to work building family trees of the genetic relatives to the suspect DNA left at the crime scene in an attempt to identify the contributor of the unknown DNA. The FBI built the family tree using the same tools and methods used by members of the public who wished to learn more about their ancestors. For example, the FBI consulted social media, viewed vital records, such as birth and death certificates, and viewed other information already contained in the user portal for the Genetic Genealogy Service, including unverified information submitted by other users of the Genetic Genealogy Service. The FBI also consulted subscription-based database available to law enforcement for information on individual people. The product of the genealogy conducted by the FBI was a family tree that contained the name, birth date, and death date of hundreds of relatives, as well as their familial connections between each other and the suspect Bryan Kohberger. The FBI then sent to local law enforcement a tip to investigate defendant. The investigative genetic genealogy process pointed law enforcement towards defendant, but did not provide law enforcement with evidence of guilt. The FBI did not, for example, conduct a direct comparison between the SNP profile from the K-bar knife sheath and defendant's SNP profile. That type of direct comparison required the more traditional STR DNA analysis, which was conducted by the Idaho State Police, not the FBI. Prior to the FBI's investigative genetic genealogy efforts, the ISP laboratory developed the traditional STR DNA profile from the DNA found on the K-bar knife sheath. And that's what they use in CODIS, remember? After identification of defendant, law enforcement recovered trash from the home of defendant's parents. An ISP laboratory did STR DNA analysis of items from the trash for comparison to the unknown crime DNA. That comparison indicated the DNA found on the trash belonged to the biological father of the individual who left the DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. Pursuant to a search warrant, law enforcement then collected DNA from the defendant via a buccal swab. A traditional STR DNA comparison was done between the STR profile found on the K-bar knife sheath and defendant's DNA. The comparison showed a statistical match. Specifically, the STR profile is at least 5.37 octillion times more likely to be seen if defendant is the source than if an unrelated individual randomly selected from the general population is the source. What that number means is if in the universe there were another 8 quadrillion planet Earths with 8 billion people on them, it's possible one of those people might have the same genetic profile as Bryan Kohberger. Man, he's unlucky. I guess the real question here is using a loophole to generate a lead a big deal to people when it's really just a lead and then law enforcement still has to go out and verify the information? What's the difference between that and an informant? Informants are generally low-life individuals who are still dealing drugs, doing horrific things, but they get a pass from law enforcement because they are giving them tips on other people. Now, in those cases, law enforcement probably has no way of directly connecting an individual, but they're getting tips on them. And then they go investigate and they try to connect the individuals and the tips to crimes. In a case like this, you have a DNA profile. So a tip merely gives you an investigative lead to check something out that is 100% verifiable if correct. So once the information is gathered by the genealogist and they determine an individual and they give the lead to the detectives, they have to go out and prove it. In this case, they did exactly that. They went and they surveilled Bryan Kohberger and his travels and collected trash out of his parents' garbage can and found that the trash, after doing a DNA comparison, they found that Bryan Kohberger's father was the contributor to the DNA in the trash. That information was enough to get a warrant to collect Bryan Kohberger's DNA. Once they did that with the buccal swabs, they created the STR profile that they use in CODIS because the profile of the knife sheath DNA was already in there. They did a one-to-one comparison and it was a match. And the match was so great that you'd have to have 8 quadrillion planet Earths with 8 billion people on each of those planets to have a possibility of one match. And I think another way to look at this right here is, see, a lot of people are saying, well, touch DNA isn't really valuable. Well, touch DNA is valuable when the DNA is found in a particular location that matters. Like if DNA is found on a doorknob, that doesn't mean as much, but it's found on a buckle of a knife sheath, then it's extremely important because the knife sheath was laying on the bed next to Madison Mogen, and they were all killed by what police believe was a K-bar knife. So a way to look at it is this. If you don't believe that the DNA means anything that was on that knife sheath, let's just say that you purely believe it was transferred there. I mean, Kohberger, let's pretend that Kohberger went to a McDonald's and touched a doorknob, and then one of the girls touched the doorknob, and then later, while fighting the real attacker, her hand touched the K-bar knife sheath and placed that person's DNA on the button snap of the knife sheath. Let's say you believe that. But how do you square that away with Kohberger's phone being off between 2:47 and 4:48 on the night of the murders? Exactly during the time of the murders, his phone is turned off, and a vehicle matching his exactly is driving in the neighborhood right here at 328, missing its front license plate, a white Elantra, and it does 4 different loops. As we all know, we've gone over that in many videos, and it parks right in this area, a white Elantra, one that he has. See, when they did the genetic genealogy, they wouldn't have known that he had a white Elantra. They found out about the white Elantra and Kohberger after they identified his name. They found out that his name shows up in the records as being somebody that law enforcement had noticed had a white Elantra at the time. But when they did the forensic genetic genealogy, it led to Bryan Kohberger's name as being the contributor to the DNA on the knife sheath. So what are the odds that a white Elantra matching Bryan Kohberger's vehicle is driving around in the neighborhood on the night of the murders, missing a front license plate, and then 28 minutes after the murders, his phone pings in an area near Blaine, Idaho right here, heading south, and then his phone continues to ping all the way around, and then you see the white Elantra heading this direction, and then his phone starts pinging again in Pullman, Washington at 5:30. What are the odds of that? That his phone happens to be in the general area and a car matching his vehicle is driving around in the area, and the DNA that was found on the knife sheath somehow isn't his. I think it's obvious to anybody using a rational mind that the DNA found on the knife sheath is Bryan Kohberger's, and it was on there because he is the killer of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle. So what's up for debate is, the ethics of using loopholes to generate a lead. However, the lead itself was 100% validated because the DNA matched. Now, whether or not you agree with how they obtained the lead or not is something that you can debate and discuss in the comments section. But we don't even know if they used the loophole at this point. That was just something that a genealogist in one of the hearings mentioned as a possibility. And even if that was used, what do you think about that? To me, the lead was generated by a genealogist, however they get it, and it turns out that the lead was verified 100% because the DNA matched perfectly. And if it didn't match, the lead would have been bogus. I mean, one thing you might want to ask yourself too is, what about when psychics give people a tip or a lead and law enforcement uses it and it results in finding the killer of a crime or results in finding a body? Do people complain and go, wait a minute, let's prove that, how that happened? That doesn't make any sense. Let me talk to the ghosts here. What were the spirits that communicated with you? We're going to need to talk to those. So how do you jive that? I mean, isn't that sort of a strange way to generate a lead as well? That isn't really ethical? You're just kind of taking somebody's word for it by hearing voices in their head and they pop up with a name and somehow that led to something and it was right. You know, it's a J. It starts with a J. It's a Jim. It's a Jim. J or John. Do you know somebody with a John? Oh, yeah, John. Yeah, oh, and the guy's name is Jim. Oh, it led to the... Nobody's ever asked how to explain that. All right, now if you guys could please hit that like button for me. Consider becoming a channel member as well. Last night we did a members-only live stream, and it was kind of interesting. We went over this topic and try to get some thoughts together for today's video. So again, I appreciate you watching, and as I always say, until next time.